Hey guys, it's Nate here with part 3 of automating a common data science task. This task again is automating the importation of multiple CSV files to a database. So this Python script that we're building will take multiple CSV files, clean up the table names, clean up the column headers and data types, and then import all of the values to a Postgres database. And the purpose is really to automate the entire process so that we don't have to touch a single line of code. So in the last video, we covered the automation process, completely automating the Python script. In this video, part 3, the last part, we are going to refactor the script such that all of the code is isolated into different functions. The point is to apply good software development skills to your projects, to your code, so that you can share good, usable, and scalable code with your team. Or if you're just a team of one, you can use these functions for other projects to save you time. So the entire code base and script is in my GitHub repo. The link is in the description. So let's start coding this last part. But first, if you like this type of content, please subscribe to my channel. Thanks. So I have my Python notebook open here. It's essentially untouched since part 2, the last video where we automated the entire import process. So just as a review here, what we're trying to do, if I go into the project folder, is upload these 3 CSV files into a Postgres database in a completely automated way where I don't need to touch any of the code that I've written here to do that. All right, so what the script does is it will find the CSV files and then move the CSV files to a new directory, to a new folder, and then start processing the file. And so that processing involves converting that CSV into a pandas data frame. And so as a pandas data frame, we can clean up that data frame name and use it as our database table name. We can do the same to our column names and column headers. And so that just involves cleaning up the characters in the table name and column headers where all of the text and characters are lowercase. There's no spaces and no weird symbols. So all that code is actually right here that we did in video 1 and video 2. And then the last thing is essentially to establish a connection into the Postgres database that I have on Amazon AWS. So part 1 was building all of that out. Part 2 was automating the entire process. And part 3 is applying good software development skills to isolate all of the code and put them into functions that you can then share with your team or reuse on your own for future projects. All right, let's get started. Let me show you how to break up the code and put them into functions. All right, so the first thing we want to do is just import the libraries. This essentially just stays exactly the same. So we have the first part here, which is find CSV files in the directory, which is really just this code block here, where this for loop will essentially go through your folder and find all of the CSV files and save them to a variable called CSV files. All right, so let's make this into a function. And here's how I do that. So all I'm gonna do to write a function is just type in df, and then I'm gonna call this function CSV files. And so this basically needs to be tabbed over. So the last step is to return CSV files because in the end we want a list of all of the CSV files in our folder, right? So there is no input to this function. This function can just be executed as is. And then from that, it's going to return the list of CSV files. So that's actually complete. So I'm going to clean this up and just delete these comments here. And then the next part we're going to turn into a function is these 2 bash commands here, one here and one here. So again, what this does is it implements a bash command called make directory, mkdir, and it will make a folder in your current working directory. From there, we are then going to implement a second bash command, mv move, which will then move the CSV files to the directory, to the folder that I just created. So these 2 things actually could be one function because I always want to do them in series, right? I want to create the folder and then I want to move the files to that folder. So what I'm going to do first is create the function here. This function is just going to be called configure dataset directory. and then it's going to have two inputs. The CSV files variable here, which is again the list of CSV files that I have in my folder, and then the dataset directory, which is this variable right here, which is the name of the folder that I want to create. All right, so with these two inputs, basically what I'm going to do is run these two bash commands here. So make directory, and then I'm going to move this up here to this code block. All right, and clean that up. So now just to add comments. So these comments are important because if you are sharing code with your team, they need to know what your code does. It's pretty obvious, obviously, from the code itself, but just to make things simpler, I always like to add comments like this. So one thing to look for when you are creating functions by refactoring old code, what you want to look for is whether or not these variables are all defined, right? So the first thing is datasets directory right here. That's needed to make the directory. I am supplying that variable or that value here. And then CSV files, I'm supplying that variable and list from this input. So that's good. And then CSV is just the placeholder variable for this for loop. And then my work is saved in MV file and MK directory. So it seems like all of the variables are defined. One thing I need to do is add a return. There is actually nothing to return because these are just bash commands that I'm applying. So I can just have a return without a variable attached to it. So this is essentially done. The last thing I want to do is actually bring this dataset directory variable down to this code block because this is actually going to be my main, basically the main part of the script where I execute all of the functions. So this is where I want to define the name of the directory. So my main function right now looks like this. I have the name of the dataset directory, name of the folder that I want to create. I have this function right here. So I'm going to add that. And then this function, if you go up top here, it returns CSV files, so a list of CSV files, right? So I want to save that return or that output as a variable called CSV files. From that, I want to execute this function right here, configure dataset directory. So what that's going to look like is essentially datasets directory, and then I'm going to pass these variables through. CSV files, which is this variable here, and then dataset directory, which is the name of the folder that I want to create, right? And so then I pass these two variables in to the function, and the function just executes. All right, so the third thing we want to do is create the pandas data frame from the CSV file. So I'm going to bring this code block down, and what we're going to do is turn this whole thing into a function of its own. All right, so this function is going to be called createDF. And again, what I'm doing is I'm passing the name of the directory and the list of CSV files. I'm going to write a comment here, and then I will comment what this whole thing does. So what this does is it loops through each file in my CSV files list, and then it will read the CSV file and convert that into a pandas data frame. And there's this try and except, so some error handling that I added so that if there's a problem with the encoding, we will enforce this type of encoding onto the pandas data frame. So we're actually done. And what I want to do is return the data frame. So basically the data frames that were created from converting the CSVs to a pandas data frame. So then I'll just write return df, because df is where all of my data lies now. And so now what we want to do is add the createDF function here, and then this essentially will require two inputs, dataset directory and CSV file. So what I'll do is actually just copy and paste that here. And because createDF returns or outputs the data frame, I'm going to save that as df in the main script here. All right, so now let's test these three functions to see if we're able to isolate and identify the CSV files and move them into a directory called datasets, and then turning those CSV files into a pandas data frame. So we'll run this code and then run this main part here. All right, so it just basically printed out the bash commands, which is expected because I have this print statement here. We can just get rid of that. But the main check is really two things: to see if the datasets were moved, and it looks like the datasets folder was created, and inside this folder, the 3 CSV files were moved. So that's done. And then the last check is to see if the DF, if the data frame exists. And it looks like it does. All right, so that's good. So now we are ready to define functions for clean table names and column names. This part is a little bit more complicated. So what I have here is essentially a big for loop that will go through the list of CSV files and then clean the table name, so clean the file name, turn all of the characters into lowercase, get rid of spaces and get rid of symbols, and then do the same thing for the column headers. And then lastly here, define the table schema using this code here. So if you need a refresher on all of this code and what it does, go back to part 1 of this video series. The link is in the description below, and I explain what all of this stuff actually means. But what we're going to do to define basically a function that will clean the table names and the column names is we're going to grab all of this here, right? Because this is the stuff that defines the table names and column names. All of the code below this basically deals with the database. So we want to create a different function to handle the database stuff. All right, so I basically just copied and pasted the top half of that entire code block where it deals with cleaning up the table names and column headers here. So now we want to define how many functions we want to create and how to do it. So what it looks like I need to do is define a function that will clean the table name here. So this is this code. So I'm going to put it down here. And then we're going to define a second function to clean up the column headers. And that will basically be this. So I'll put that in this code block here. All right. This is going to be now part of my main, part of the main Python script. And so I'm going to keep the for loop in the main and not actually do the for loop in these functions here. So this code here is going to turn into a function called clean table name. So what I need to do is actually replace k with this variable here. So anytime I see k, I'm going to just replace that with file name. So what this will do is it will clean up the CSV file name. And in the second part, it will basically chop off the CSV extension and it will save the left-hand side of that entire file name. That becomes the name of our database table. So what we want to return in this function is the table name. All right, and so now this is just my main 2. So I'll just call this main part 2. So what I want to do is call this function clean table name. And I'm going to pass in this file name. This file name is actually k, right? Because the CSV file names are actually stored in this k parameter here. Because this for loop, the k is a temporary variable that will go through the list of CSV files that I have stored in this list called CSV files. So whatever value k holds, which is going to be either customer contracts.csv, customer engagements.csv, or customer demo.csv, k will be one of those 3 files. And so it will then pass through this clean table name function here to be then cleaned and processed so that we can then create a database table. All right, so now my second function is cleaning up the columns and then creating the code for the table schema. So I'm going to call my function clean column name, which basically has an input data frame, and it will go through the columns and process it by, making all of the characters lowercase, again, getting rid of the spaces, getting rid of the symbols. And then here's the dictionary that replaces the data types. It converts pandas data types to Postgres or SQL data types. And then it creates the entire SQL code to create that table in Postgres. All right, so again, refer to part 1 if you need an explanation of what all of this stuff means. All right, so here we need to figure out what to actually return from this function. So what we want to return obviously is going to be this table schema code here. So call string is 1, and then this is the second thing we want to return because we want the data frame columns, the cleaned up version of the data frame columns, right? This is what the function is supposed to do. All right, so this looks completely defined. We have data frame here, and then we have the variables data frame here. Everything else looks defined. So now in my main, what I can do is have this function called clean call name. We're going to pass this data frame variable, which is essentially the data frame of one of the CSV files, into this function here. So one last thing about this part of the main is that I need to save the output of these two functions I just created. So the output of clean table name is the name of the database table. And then the output of clean column names is basically these two variables here. So I can easily just copy and paste those variables and basically save all of that output into these two variables here. All right, so let me bring this main down below these two functions and maybe we can test it out. So I will run this function and then run this function and then run that. Nothing actually gets outputted, but we can test, right? So let's just test what that table name is. Customer demo. This is basically the result of the last element or the last CSV file in the list CSV files. And then same thing for call string. Yep. And then data frame columns. There you go. So we get something for each one of these functions. So I think it's correct. And so the last thing to do now is actually upload all of the data to our database. So all of this code, all it really does is it opens up the database, creates a table, and then inserts the values from the CSV file to that table. This could be all one function, and that's what we're going to do here. So there's going to be a lot of inputs to this function as you see here. I'm calling this function upload to database. I have essentially the host variable, which is the address to my AWS Postgres database, the database name, the user, the passwords of that database, so my credentials basically, and then the name of the table that I want to create, and then the schema code, the file name, the data frame name, and then the columns of that data frame. And so all of this will make sense once I explain it. So one thing I want to do is actually I want to pass up these credentials, these database credentials to my main. So I will then just bring it up to this main part 2. This connection string, we have the host, the database table name, the user, and the password here, right? And so all of these are actually already passed through this function and they can be found here. And then this establishes a connection to the database. We also pass the table name here and here, so that's good. We are creating then the table with this command here. So we have the table name and column string, which is right here. So now we are inserting values into the table, and this is the code that does it. So the one thing I'm noticing is this K here. This K doesn't belong because instead of K, we want to replace this with the name of the file, which is actually this variable here. We're going to call this file instead of K. And then the second thing I'm looking at is data frame dot columns. We are actually passing through a variable called data frame underscore columns. So now we will just replace that with data frame underscore columns. All of this remains the same. My file equals open K. Again, the file name is not K, it's file, because we are defining this function here as file, not as K. And then the SQL statement looks to stay the same. And so everything else looks like it's fine. So what I'll do is just delete this message here. So this function looks to be complete. Let us put it into this main Python script here. And then the last thing to do is define all of these variables that I want to pass to this function, right? So host is equals host, right? We've already defined it up here. DB name is defined here. User and passwords are defined as well. Table name, this variable, it's going to grab from this function here, the output of clean table name function. Column string, same thing. It'll grab it from the output of clean column name. Dataframe.columns is actually right here. So what we're going to do is say dataframe. So dataframe underscore columns is equal to dataframe.columns. And then dataframe here is just this dataframe, so we're good. The last bit is this file name right here. Like, what is that, right? This file name is actually K because we are progressing through the list of CSVs in this variable called CSV files. So in this for loop, wherever we are in that for loop is K, and that's the name of our file. All right, so just to refactor it to make things look a little nicer, add a comment here. So with all of this done, we can actually test this part out now too. So let's do that. All right, so after testing, I have all of these print statements here, and it looks like the database was opened successfully. We were able to create the customer contracts table, open the file, and put it into the database table. And then we did that for all of the other CSV files that we have in our list, and there are 3 CSV files, and so 3 database tables were created. And then the last thing to do is to combine the 2 main parts of the script, and I'll show you that right now. All right, so this is what the complete main part of the script would look like. Essentially, from the beginning, we have the name of our folder we're going to create here called datasets. Then we have the database settings here, which is essentially my login credentials. And then we have the functions that we created that's above this main, CSV files, configuring the dataset directory function, and then creating the data frames. So converting the CSV files to a pandas data frame, that function here. And then we have this for loop, which then goes through each element or each CSV file in the list of CSV files, and then cleans up the file name, cleans up the column headers, and then prepares it and uploads it into the Postgres database. So all of these functions here do that. So when you take a look at this main here, everything's super clean, right? You have all of your settings here, which don't really need to change unless your database credentials change or logins change. And then all of these functions here do all of the work, and they're automated where you don't actually need to edit any of the code. And so all of this work, again, is stored in functions that are at the top of this notebook here. And so we now have an idea of what all of these functions do, and they're all isolated from each other. So this is essentially good software development skills that we're applying to keep our code, one, very clean and concise. It keeps it isolated from each other. All the work is basically divided up into small little components, and it's completely automated and scalable. So I can have 1 CSV file, or I can process 100 CSV files, and I won't need to change any part of the code whatsoever. The last thing I want to do is actually take all of these functions that are currently in this Python notebook and take it out of the notebook itself and place it in a Py file outside of this notebook. Basically, then we're going to import all of these functions to this notebook itself, just like you would import pandas or import NumPy. All right, so the first thing we want to do is essentially separate out the functions from this main component here. So what I can do is just create a new notebook. And probably the easiest thing to do here is just copy and paste this into the new notebook. This is our main. And then I can delete this. And then I will also take these libraries and put them here. I'll just keep this library here. All right, so what I want to do is just save this, download as a Py file. So taking this Python notebook that has an extension IPYNB and change it into a Py file. That's going to download to my computer. And so I basically uploaded that Py file and renamed it CSV import functions here. And so if I open that up, I basically have all of the functions and comments that I created from this notebook here. Okay, so I actually don't need this Python notebook anymore. So basically I just have this Python notebook that contains the code from my main part of the script and none of the functions. So what we need to do now is just import all of the functions that we created. All right, so the way to do that is this. From CSV import functions, which is the name of my Py file, import star. So import everything, import all of the functions. That way I can just basically call all of these functions here just as is without changing any of my code, and it should run. So let's test it out. So what we have here in the output is taking these 3 CSV files and then opening up a database connection, creating the database table and inserting or importing the values or the data to that database table. And we do that for all 3 of the CSV files, right? So what was before a really long Python notebook is now something that's really short and clean. And then you could actually reuse all of these functions here for other projects, or your team could also take this Py file, take these functions and use it for their projects as well. So that's basically it for this Python series. What we did was we created a script that would take CSV files, clean them up, create a database table, and then automatically import all of the data to these database tables. So I hope you like this Python series. I hope you guys learned something. Leave comments on this video, give me feedback, give me ideas. I can create more of this, or I can stick to more data science interview stuff, or more SQL coding, or I can jump into more Python coding. So a lot of it is really up to you guys. If you like this type of content, please subscribe to my channel if you haven't done so yet. And I hope to see you guys in the future. Thanks.